My own daughter-in-law handed me a glass of iced tea with a smile I had seen 1,000 times, and something in my gut told me not to drink it. I set it down. My wife didn't. That was the last thing I remember before the water closed over my head. My name is Harold Mercer. I am 68 years old. I spent 35 years as a high school principal in rural Kentucky, and I believed, genuinely, deeply believed, that I understood people. I could spot a troubled kid from across a cafeteria. I could read a parent's face before they finished their first sentence. I built an entire career on knowing when someone was lying to me. I did not see my own son coming. If you have ever poured everything you had into raising a child, working double shifts, skipping your own needs, telling yourself it was worth it because one day he would make you proud, and then had that child look you in the eye and decide your life was worth less than his mortgage payment, hit that like button. I need to know I am not the only one who lived through this. Before I tell you how my wife and I crawled out of a lake in the middle of the night and brought our own son to his knees, tell me in the comments what state you are watching from. Your presence here is the only reason I can still speak about this without losing my mind. It started with a fishing trip. That is the part that breaks me every time I think about it. Not a hiking trail, not a cliff, not some dramatic overlook. A fishing trip to Lake Cumberland. The same lake where I taught my son to cast a line when he was 7 years old. He called me in early October and said he wanted to reconnect. He said he had been distant, that work had been consuming him, that he felt guilty about how little we had seen each other. He said, "Dad, let's go up to the cabin, just us and the women, like we used to." My wife was so happy she cried. She stood in the kitchen, packing sandwiches and humming to herself, and I watched her from the doorway, thinking that maybe things were going to be okay after all. We had been worried about my son for months. There had been a coldness in him that I could not explain. A way he looked through me during phone calls rather than at me. My wife kept saying it was stress, that he and his wife were adjusting to a new life, that we needed to give them space. I told myself she was right. I ignored the instinct that had served me for 35 years. We arrived at the cabin on a Friday evening. The October air was sharp and clean off the water, and the trees along the bank were burning orange and red, the way they only do in Kentucky in the fall. My son met us at the door. He looked thin. His handshake was too firm, the kind of grip that is performing strength rather than expressing it. His wife came out behind him carrying a pitcher of iced tea and wearing a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She had always been charming. That was the word people used for her, charming. She could walk into any room and make everyone inside it feel seen and special. At our first Thanksgiving together, she had pulled out my wife's hand-painted recipe cards, the ones her grandmother had left her, and asked to copy every single one. My wife had wept with gratitude. I remember thinking what a wonderful addition she was to our family. I know now that charm is simply manipulation with better lighting. We had dinner on the porch overlooking the water. My son was quiet, but not uncomfortably so. His wife talked enough for all four of us, asking questions about our neighbors back home, about my wife's garden, about whether we had updated the will recently. I remember that question. I remember the way my son looked at his plate when she asked it, and the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly when I said yes. We had just met with our attorney in September. After dinner, she poured the iced tea. My wife took hers immediately. I reached for mine and then set it back down. Not because of any specific reason I could name, but because of a pressure behind my sternum that 35 years of reading people had taught me to respect. I excused myself to use the restroom, and when I came back, my wife's glass was empty and mine was still sitting on the railing, untouched. Within 40 minutes, my wife said she felt dizzy. She leaned against me on the porch swing, and her words began to blur at the edges, running together in a way that had nothing to do with tiredness. I held her hand and felt her grip go slack. And I looked across the table at my son and his wife, and something in their posture, a stillness, a waiting, made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. "I think she needs to lie down," my daughter-in-law said, already standing, already reaching. The dock was between the cabin and the water. "I understand that now. There was no reason to walk my wife toward the water to help her rest. There was no reason for my son to be walking on my other side, his hand on my arm. There was no reason for any of it except the one reason I still cannot fully accept. My wife went over the edge of the dock first. I heard the splash. I turned toward the sound, and that is when my son shoved me. It was not a stumble. It was not an accident. It was a deliberate, two-handed shove between my shoulder blades with every ounce of weight he had behind it, and I hit the water face first in the dark. Lake Cumberland in October is 48 degrees. The cold hit me like a wall of concrete. Every muscle in my body seized. My lungs tried to inhale and found water instead of air, and I thrashed to the surface, gasping, disoriented, unable to tell which direction was shore. The dock lights were off. Someone had turned off the dock lights. I heard my wife sputtering somewhere to my left. "Harold," she was saying, and her voice was strange and thick from whatever they had put in that tea. I swam toward her voice. I found her arm. I pulled her against me and tread water and tried to think through the ice water, shattering my concentration into pieces. Above us on the dock, I could hear them. Did they go under? My son's voice, not panicked, not destroyed with grief, asking a question with the same tone he used when checking whether the dishwasher had finished its cycle. "I can't see them." Her voice, flat, professional. "The current runs east," my son said. "Even if they surface, they'll go toward the far bank. Nobody finds them until spring." I held my wife in the freezing water, and I did not make a sound. She understood before I did. Even drugged and barely coherent, even unable to stay upright on her own, she pressed her face against my shoulder and went still. She was a retired emergency room nurse. She had spent 20 years keeping people alive in impossible circumstances. Even now, even like this, her instincts were better than mine. "Play dead," she breathed into my neck. "Don't let them hear us. Don't move." I have never experienced terror like that. Not in any disciplinary meeting, not in any confrontation in 35 years of dealing with the hardest situations a school can produce. Nothing had ever reached into my chest and grabbed my heart the way my son's voice did in that moment, unhurried, calculating, already moving on. "Call it in," he said. "Give it 20 minutes, then call it in." They were drinking on the dock. Dad always had a second glass of bourbon after dinner. Mom can't swim well. It was dark. They were old. They were old. That was what he said. They were old, as if our age was the explanation. As if 68 and 65 were sufficient reasons for the water to take us and for the world to nod and move on. My wife and I drifted in the dark water for what felt like an hour. The cold was a living thing pressing into my bones, trying to turn my muscles to stone. I kept moving my legs just enough to stay afloat, slow and small, praying the ripples didn't carry. The dock lights came back on after a while, but we had drifted far enough east that the beam didn't find us. I steered us along the far bank, pulling my wife through the shallows with one arm, ignoring the way my body was screaming at me to stop, to rest, to give up. We found the old boat ramp 3/4 of a mile downstream. I don't know how long it took. Time had stopped working correctly. I dragged us both onto the concrete and lay there gasping. My wife curled against me, shaking so violently her teeth sounded like a handful of loose coins. "Hypothermia," she said through the shaking. 20 minutes. We have to warm up in 20 minutes or we lose the ability to make decisions. I looked around the boat ramp. There was a maintenance shed at the top of the path, one of the county park storage units. I had seen it dozens of times without ever thinking about it. I thought about it now. I got my wife to her feet, and we moved. The lock was a standard padlock. I had spent enough years dealing with school maintenance crews to know that county facilities are padlocked with the same 3 master key codes they have used since 1987. I found a rock and broke the hasp on the 3rd try. Inside, there were road flares, orange safety vests, an emergency blanket in a foil packet, and a propane camping lantern. There was also, on a shelf in the back, a hooded rain slicker that had been left by some maintenance worker and forgotten. I put it on my wife. I wrapped the emergency blanket around both of us. I lit the propane lantern and set it at our feet and held my wife until she stopped shaking. "He planned this," she said eventually. Her voice was steady now, stripped of everything except the pure, clean fact of what she was saying. "He planned this, Harold. The timing, the dock lights, the story about the bourbon, he planned every piece of it." I knew she was right. I had known since the moment I felt his hands on my back. "We have to go back," I said. She looked at me. In 38 years of marriage, I had seen every expression my wife's face was capable of making. This one was new. It was not surprise. It was not grief. It was the expression of a woman who has just realized she is standing in a fire and has decided to burn back instead of run. "Not yet," she said. "We go back when we are ready. We go back when we have everything we need. We go back when there is nothing left they can do to us." The cabin sits on a wooded 2-acre lot. I designed the property layout myself, the same way I had designed every aspect of our life here, deliberately, with attention to contingencies. The outbuilding behind the main structure was originally a workshop I had used during the summers after retirement. 3 years ago, after a conversation with my doctor about what the statistics said about couples our age living remotely, I had quietly converted the back section of that workshop into what my wife called my worry room, a reinforced space with an independent power supply, a shortwave radio, and enough food and water for 2 weeks. I told my son I had converted the whole building into a gardening shed. We reached it just before 3 in the morning. The lock combination was our wedding anniversary. My wife's hands were still trembling, but she got it on the second try. We were inside before the trees stopped moving. I sat down on the floor and did an inventory of my body the same way I had taught myself to do after every crisis in my professional life. My right knee was badly swollen from the dock impact. My core temperature was still low. I was mildly concussed. The edges of my vision kept softening. My wife was better physically, but the drug in her system was still working its way out, making her movements slightly uncoordinated. We were alive. We were free. We were 50 yards from the people who had tried to kill us. The shortwave radio had a range of 200 miles. I turned it to the frequency I had been told to use in emergencies by the one person in the world I trusted unconditionally, my older brother Ray, who had retired from the state police after 30 years and now lived in Lexington. Ray had given me that frequency 11 years ago over a beer on this very porch, saying, "If you ever need me and the phones are down, Harold, you talk to me on this." I had thought he was being dramatic. I had kept the frequency written on a piece of tape on the back of the unit anyway. I keyed the radio. It took 4 attempts. On the 5th, I heard his voice. He did not ask questions. He did not express disbelief. He said, "Are you inside?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Stay there. I'm coming. Don't use the main phone. Don't light any lights visible from the house. And Harold, don't you do anything I wouldn't do." "Ray," I said, "I need you to make some calls before you drive." I told him everything. The iced tea, the dock, the voices in the dark. When I finished, Ray was quiet for 4 seconds. I counted, and then he said, "The insurance. Has he filed anything yet?" I hadn't thought of that. I had been too occupied with survival to think about what came next for them. But Ray had spent 30 years watching people, and he had immediately understood what I was still catching up to. "Give me 2 hours, Ray said. "I'll make the calls. Then I'm driving up." Those 2 hours were the longest of my life. I sat in the dark of the workshop with my wife asleep against my shoulder, and I watched the main cabin through the crack in the shuttered window. The lights stayed on until nearly 4 in the morning. At one point, I saw my son step out onto the porch and stand at the railing looking at the water. He had a beer in his hand. He stood there for a long time. I had a memory, uninvited and brutal, of standing at that same railing with him when he was 11 years old. We had been out on the water all day and caught nothing. And he was disappointed in the way that only children can be, completely, without any sense of proportion. I had put my arm around his shoulders and told him that the point of fishing was never the fish. He had looked up at me with that open, uncomplicated face he used to have and said, "Then what's the point?" And I had laughed and said, "The point is, you and me standing here, son. That's the whole point." He stood at the railing now and drank his beer and did not look for us. I understood then that the boy I was remembering had been gone for a long time. I just hadn't been paying attention to the departure. Ray arrived before dawn. He did not come to the front door of the cabin. He came to the workshop because I had told him where to find us, and he knocked twice. Paused, knocked once more. The same pattern he had used his whole life when we were kids, and he was sneaking into my room after curfew. I opened the door, and he looked at us. Soaking clothes, half-dried, emergency blanket, my wife's gray hair matted, my knee swollen to twice its size. And he said nothing for a moment. Then he set down his bag and pulled me into a hug that felt like being held up by the earth itself. "Tell me what you need," he said. Ray had made 3 calls on the drive up. The first was to a detective he trusted in the state police, a woman named Agent Caldwell who specialized in financial crimes and was not, he was careful to clarify, connected to the local department my son had apparently already spoken to the previous evening. The second was to our family attorney Marcus Webb, who was also Ray's personal attorney and who had, it turned out, received a call that very morning from my son about expediting a death certificate. The third call was to the insurance company, where Ray had asked to speak to the fraud investigation unit. When Ray told me about Marcus Webb's call, I felt the cold come back. Not the lake cold. Something worse. Something internal. My son had called Marcus at 7 in the morning. He had been calm and professional. He had expressed his grief. He had asked about the process for declaring 2 people deceased under circumstances where recovery of remains was uncertain. Marcus had taken the call, offered his condolences, and called Ray 20 minutes later because something about the timing had felt wrong to him. Good attorneys are like good principals. They know when something is being managed. While we waited in the workshop, I powered up the old tablet I kept in the emergency supplies for exactly this kind of situation. It was connected to the shortwave modem I had installed 3 years ago. Slow and clunky, but functional. I accessed the security camera system I had wired through the cabin walls back when I built the workshop, a hardwired loop that my son did not know existed because I had never mentioned it, and he had never thought to ask what the small lenses in the crown molding were. The images were grainy and low resolution, but they were enough. I watched my son and his wife in the kitchen. I watched them review what appeared to be documents on the table. I watched my daughter-in-law on the phone, calm, composed, nodding, the same practiced warmth she deployed on everyone. At one point, she laughed at something the person on the other end said, and the sound of it came through the audio feed thin and distant, and my wife, who had woken up and was watching beside me, made a sound I had never heard her make before. It was not a cry. It was something older than crying. She practiced it, my wife said. She practiced that laugh. Around noon, a man arrived at the cabin who I did not recognize. He was well-dressed and carrying a leather portfolio. He shook my son's hand with the ease of familiarity, and my daughter-in-law hugged him with a warmth that was different from the warmth she showed strangers. I zoomed the camera as far as it would go. Ray was sitting beside me. When he saw the man's face, he put his hand on my arm. "I know him," Ray said. "He was involved in 2 property fraud cases in Jefferson County. The charges didn't stick." He paused. "He is also, if I remember correctly, a licensed estate attorney." I looked at my wife. She was looking at the screen. "They brought their own lawyer," she said quietly. "They didn't trust Marcus. They brought someone already in their pocket." We watched the 3 of them spread documents across my kitchen table. We watched my daughter-in-law point to specific lines and my son sign where she indicated. We watched the attorney smile and accept a glass of my bourbon and lean back in my chair with the ease of a man who believes he is untouchable. That evening, Ray drove into town and met with Agent Caldwell in a gas station parking lot. He brought the tablet with the footage. He brought the audio recording I had made of my son's voice on the dock. The one I had captured on the waterproof emergency recorder I keep clipped to my keys out of a habit born from 35 years of needing to document difficult conversations. 2 minutes and 40 seconds of my son's voice in the dark, saying everything that needed to be said. Caldwell listened to it once, then she listened to it again. "How do you want to do this?" Ray asked her. She thought about it for a moment. "We let the paperwork go through," she said. "We let them sign everything. We let them walk into the bank, and then we closed the door." The following morning was a Tuesday. My son had scheduled a formal meeting with Marcus Webb for 10 o'clock. Apparently, he had decided, after the conversation with his own attorney, that having the family lawyer present would legitimize the process. Marcus, who was now fully briefed, had agreed to host the meeting at his office in town. My wife and I spent the night before that meeting preparing in silence. Not sleeping. Preparing. We had dry clothes from the workshop's emergency supplies. Not our best. Not what we would have chosen. But clean. We did not use them. We put back on the clothes we had been wearing when we went into the water. They had dried in the workshop over 2 days into stiff, salt-rimmed shapes that held the outline of the lake. My wife's blouse was torn at the collar where the current had caught it. My own jacket still smelled of algae and cold water. "We are the evidence," my wife said, echoing something I hadn't said aloud but had been thinking. I nodded. I understood. We drove to town with Ray just before 10, staying below the sight lines of the cabin windows. My knee had been wrapped by Ray in a proper brace from his kit, and while walking was painful, I could manage. We parked behind Marcus's office building and waited. At 3 minutes past 10, my son and his wife walked through Marcus's front door. At 4 minutes past 10, Ray and Agent Caldwell walked in after them. We went in last. Marcus had arranged his conference room with the particular deliberate neutrality of a man who knows he is sitting at the center of something that is going to matter for a long time. My son and his wife were seated on one side of the long table. The outside attorney, the one from the night before, was beside my daughter-in-law with his portfolio open. 2 chairs on the other side of the table were empty. My son was looking at his phone when we walked through the door. He looked up because of the sound my knee brace made on the hardwood floor. The click and drag of it, rhythmic and patient. The color left his face the way a cloud shadow leaves a field, fast and total. His mouth opened, his wife saw his expression and turned, and the portfolio slid off the table and hit the floor, and neither of them moved to pick it up. I stood in the doorway and looked at my son. My wife was beside me. Behind us, Ray and Agent Caldwell filled the frame. I did not shout. I had never needed to shout in 35 years of managing people at their worst. Volume is for people who are not certain they are right. "You're using the wrong pen," I said. My voice was quiet and completely steady. "That one's mine. Marcus keeps my pens in the second drawer." The outside attorney stood up first. He reached for his portfolio, then saw Caldwell's badge and left it on the floor. My daughter-in-law found her voice before my son did. She was extraordinary, even then. Even caught in the center of the impossible, she reached for the performance. "Harold." Her voice was warm with shock. Her hand went to her heart. "Oh my God, Harold, you're alive. We thought we've been searching. We called everyone. We called I know what you called," I said. I walked to the table, one slow step at a time. I set the recorder down in the center. I pressed play. The room heard my son's voice say, "Nobody finds them until spring." My daughter-in-law stopped speaking. She did not look at the recorder. She looked at my son, and in that look, in that single, unguarded fraction of a second, I saw what their marriage actually was. 2 people who had used each other as tools and were now calculating, independently and simultaneously, whether the other one could be traded away. My son had been looking at the recorder. Now he looked at her. He saw the same thing I saw. He turned to Caldwell. He opened his mouth, and then he said the only honest thing he had said in longer than I could calculate. "She planned it. I want a lawyer. Not him." He gestured at the attorney on the floor. "A real one." Agent Caldwell nodded slowly. "That's your right," she said. She looked at my daughter-in-law. "You too." The arrests were quiet. No shouting, no running, nothing dramatic. My son walked out of Marcus's conference room in handcuffs, and he did not look at me as he passed. My daughter-in-law looked at me. She held my gaze for a long moment with an expression I could not fully read, not remorse, not quite defiance. Something more complicated than either. Then she was gone. The outside attorney was taken separately for questioning regarding the fraudulent estate documents. I was told later that he began cooperating within 40 minutes. Marcus poured 2 cups of coffee and set them in front of my wife and me, and then left us alone in the conference room. We sat there for a while without speaking. "Do you want to go back to the cabin?" my wife asked eventually. I thought about the railing where I had stood with my son. I thought about the dock lights going out. I thought about the sound the water made when my wife went in. "No," I said, "not today." She nodded. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. Outside the window, the October trees were still burning. There are things people tell you about grief that turn out to be accurate. They tell you it is not linear. They tell you it arrives in unexpected moments. Not at the grave or the sentencing, but at the grocery store, when you reach for a brand of cereal you only bought because your child preferred it. They tell you that love and loss are not opposites, but layers of the same thing, and that you can mourn a person who is still alive with the same completeness as one who isn't. No one tells you about the relief. I am telling you now. 6 months later, my wife and I are living in a rented house in a small town in western North Carolina that we have never been to before in our lives. We chose it from a map with no other criteria than that it was far from Kentucky and within walking distance of a good diner. The neighbors do not know who we are. The trees are different here. Different shapes, different colors in the fall. I sit on the porch most mornings and listen to sounds I don't yet recognize, and I find that I prefer it. The strangeness is clean. My son is awaiting trial. My daughter-in-law accepted a plea. The outside attorney got 18 months and lost his license. Marcus oversees a trust in our names, structured so that whatever we have will go, when we are genuinely gone, to the 2 grandchildren from my son's first marriage. Children who were kept at arm's length for years by a woman who found them inconvenient, and who deserve better than the inheritance of all this damage. I received 1 letter from my son. I read it. He did not apologize in the way people mean when they use that word. He explained. He justified. He expressed at some length the financial pressures that had made everything feel impossible. He used the word corner 4 times in 2 pages, as if the corner he was in had built itself around him without his participation. I did not write back. There is a version of this story where I forgive him, and we find our way back to something. I have thought about that version. I understand why it is appealing, why it feels like the right ending. The complete ending, the one that closes all the doors neatly. But I spent 35 years in schools watching what happens when the wrong behavior gets rewarded with reconciliation it has not earned. I know what that teaches. Some structures cannot be repaired. Sometimes the most responsible thing an engineer can do is walk away from the site and let the building come down. I am sitting on the porch in North Carolina writing this. My wife is inside making coffee. The trees here are unfamiliar, but they are mine now. These particular trees outside this particular rented house in this particular new life we are building from what we carried out of the water. If this story found you today, if you have ever had to choose between who you love and whether you survive that love, leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me your story if you have one. You are not as alone in it as you think. My name is Harold Mercer. I went into the water and I came back out, and I am not finished yet.